Welcome to The Brief, Tracking the Empire. I'm Nora Barrows-Friedman with John Elmer. Justin is away. On this episode, riots and abolition. Demonstrations continue across the United States against police violence and increasingly against the institution itself.
Looting, especially by a crowd led by Black people in the streets, attacked that entire history of the police, the property, and whiteness. And that terrifies people, and understandably so, because it's the whole world that they live in. Briefly being shown to be an absurd lie held by a policeman's baton and a sheet of plate glass.
If we are going to make a change that is transformative, we are going to lose things that are comfortable to us in order to gain a kind of collective safety and security.
We speak with Vicky, Osterweil, and Zoe Samudzi about riots, looting, and abolishing the police. Hey, John.
Hi, Nora.
How's it going?
It's going all right. It's quite a time to be alive.
Yeah, no kidding.
So this is part 2 of our Uprising in America series. We're going to focus on riots and abolition, and we're joined by Vicky Osterweil and Zoe Samudzi, and we're doing our first brief roundtable. It's exciting to have Vicky and Zoe with us.
Yeah, absolutely. I've recently been introduced to Vicky's work. She's an extraordinary researcher on racism, white supremacy, revolution. Her new book is coming out any day now. It's called In Defense of Looting, A Riotous History of Uncivil Action. And Zoe Samudzi is a long time and dear friend of mine. She's a researcher and writer and essayist and the co-author of the really phenomenal, essential book, As Black as Resistance, Finding the Conditions for Liberation. So we thought by having them on together, we could parse out what's happening in the U.S. and how settler colonialism and white supremacy and the police all interact.
Yeah, the thing that's excellent about Vicky's book is the way that she tracks the history of these institutions, police forces and prisons that we kind of, at this point, think are natural right to have prisons and police. So they've always been there, but they're a construct, and they were built very specifically to enforce a white hierarchy, a white capitalist hierarchy in the 19th century amid rebellions. They're essentially anti-rebellion, anti-slave rebellion, anti-indigenous, of course, was part of clearing the land and putting natives in reservations and reserves, required policing. And so the NYPD founded essentially as slave catchers. And the same thing in Canada with the RCMP, or the Northwest Mounted Police, which were essentially an anti-indigenous force used to corral natives on reserves. So
let's go to the briefing.
Okay, let's do it.
The briefing.
So we're now almost coming up on 2 months of sustained demonstrations happening across the United States against police violence, and as we say, increasingly against the institution itself. And it's gone from the streets to the front page of the New York Times. The New York Times posited in a front page story last week that the Black Lives Matter protests are the largest protests in U.S. history. On the peak of them on the 6th of June, demonstrations took place in 1,300 counties, 95% of them majority white, and 3/4 of them more than 3/4 white. And the New York Times posits between 15 and 26 million people took part in the demonstrations, and pointed out that the Harvard Kennedy School likes to use the number 3.5% participating in demonstrations to overthrow a government. So significantly higher than those numbers. I mean, polling shows that Black Lives Matter are more popular than Trump, Biden, any political party, any politician. They're more popular than the media, Congress, Senate. And they're almost as popular as the military. There's almost 3/4 of the population are now in support of these demonstrations. Meanwhile, Trump is running for re-election to the White House on essentially a race war platform, and he announced it. He's been announcing it since he was born, but he announced it in practice at Mount Rushmore in the Black Hills on unceded Sioux territory. And yeah, as the New York Times pointed out, almost every day in the last 2 weeks, Trump has sought to stoke white fear and resentment, portraying himself as a protector of an old order that polls show much of Americans believe perpetuates entrenched racism, and they want to move beyond. That's the New York Times way of avoiding calling him a racist or saying it's a race war. But yeah, we've seen very many tangible results on the ground. I mean, even something as symbolic as the statues, the headless Columbus statues. You know, even in the UK, they had to put a box around the Winston Churchill statue, which was an amazing optic. And they're taking down these monuments effectively to curb the riots, the momentum of the riots. And corporate America, as we talked about before, has backed this, and racist sports teams like the Washington Football Slurs have changed their name essentially because corporate America decided that they needed to take a position on this. But that hasn't done much for the street, definitely hasn't quelled the protests, and corporate America is very much in the target of these demonstrations as well. There was a guillotine set up outside Jeff Bezos' home last week, which was, again, an interesting optic. The police responded to these demonstrations with really entrenching the legacy of the institution. Rather than taking a step back and reflecting, they intensified the police brutality and the techniques of mass surveillance. They used aerial drones in 15 cities, papers reported, feeding aerial footage back to the Department of Homeland Security to be stored. There was Predator drones deployed over Minneapolis tracking looters. But there has been significant impacts. There was the lawyer for the Minneapolis police, for 150 Minneapolis police officers, said that they're too scared to work, quote unquote, after their precinct was sacked. The 3rd precinct sacking and burning. The 3rd precinct was where the officer in Minneapolis who killed George Floyd was stationed out of. The 4 officers that killed him were stationed out of, and that was burned to the ground, or large portions of it burned. So this phenomena in Minneapolis where the lawyers are claiming PTSD, and the phenomena of cops essentially too scared to work now because the protests are so significant. And we saw that at the White House too when they turned the lights out and Trump had to hide in a bunker, which we always like to point out on this show. But really the thing that has changed is that the impunity of the practice of policing is being targeted. And there's been tangible results: firing of officers, resignations of police chiefs, arrests of officers involved, the opening of disciplinary records, the removal of police officers from schools, which is an important one. These school resource officers, there's tens of thousands of them in the United States, making hundreds of thousands of arrests every year for essentially standard youth conflict that's normally not handled by police in any other country. And it's put this concept of defunding the police on the table at city municipalities, municipal governments across North America. And as we're going to talk about on the show today, defunding is an abolitionist demand, but it's only one small part of it. The abolishing the police and the carceral prison system. It's not just about laws and enforcement, but also about those things that go around it to create a collective security like education, health, housing, recreation. And all these topics are on the table now with no real signs of ending. It's really a remarkable moment in the United States right now.
Yeah, it is. And I think we've got the perfect guests to talk about it. Zoe Samudzi is a PhD candidate in sociology and the co-author of As Black as Resistance, Finding the Conditions for Liberation, published by AK Press in 2018. And Vicky Osterweil is a writer, editor, and the author of In Defense of Looting, A Riotous History of Uncivil Action. And that's coming out from Bold Type Press. Without further ado, let's hear from Zoe and Vicky.
Thanks a lot for joining us, Zoe and Vicky.
Hi, thank you.
Hi. Yeah, thank you so much for having us.
I wonder if we can just start. This moment kind of broke the frame of acceptable debate in our society. Police impunity and the institution of policing itself is all of a sudden on the table. And it was riots that blew the doors off of it, really, in the first sort of 72 hours of these demonstrations that are now more than a month old. I just want to ask you both for your reactions to this moment. Maybe, Zoe, you want to start first?
Yeah, I wasn't really sure what to expect. But, you know, every so often there are these kind of flashpoints where there is a particular killing, visualizations of a death that just really animate a revolutionary spirit. And it was, you know, seeing the marches, I was like, wow, yes, there's a lot of people marching. And then I was seeing videos of like apartment buildings getting set on fire and a Target being looted and a police department on fire. And I was like, okay, there might be something that's a little bit different about this compared to other moments that have kind of erupted across the country. And I guess we'll see what that means, in the coming months, but even the way that it has escalated from the indignation about police to like police abolition, like being on the table in this kind of mainstream serious way has been really incredible to watch.
It's been really almost overwhelming to watch these ideas like launch from the flames of a precinct into the, New York Times or whatever. It has been so widespread that the normal strategies of like liberal recuperation haven't been quite as successful, like sending in the leaders, because the Democrats spent all of their political capital defeating Bernie Sanders. And now we have Joe Biden, who's like about as inspiring as a bag of wet cement. We like don't really have enemies to the right in that way, like in our flank of our movement. Even the Social Democrats, who I think if Bernie or even Elizabeth Warren were candidates right now, so many of the white folks who came out would be arguing that it should be about elections, and so many like bail funds would have instead gone to like the election campaigns and stuff. So I think there's this sort of perfect moment where a lot of conditions are right for people to follow the Black movement that's been set into motion. Like in LA in 92, I think we actually do have this Black revolution that's being supported genuinely by the broad population. It's a genuinely popular uprising. And I think that it's quite possible that we're looking at, I mean, I'm a bit of a revolutionary optimist on this stuff, but like this might be kind of like some 1917 type shit right now, honestly. Like the economy's about to collapse again. Like it just things feel really, really like wild right now.
Let's dig down on those. Like, what are those conditions?
I want to be very clear that like I'm not an accelerationist. Like I don't think it's good when things get worse. It's bad. But before this movement started, I was incredibly depressed because this financial collapse that has not yet hit all the way is coming. It was going to come whether or not we had coronavirus. It was going to come whether or not Trump or someone more competent was in the White House. The crisis of 2008 got kicked down the road, and the bill has finally come due. The Chinese market expansion is no longer sufficient. Like their economy is starting to slip. The BRICS aren't doing it. Like we're just due for a major financial collapse. And also the pandemic is, I mean, a complete totally like crazy social situation. One of my friends, when we were out in the street, said, sort of people having to like stay alone inside their house for 3 months and then like going out to the biggest burst of riots since the 60s was like everyone had been edging. That pressure combined with what's about to be a wave of really, really horrible economic contraction and a really, really split capitalist class. Trumpism seems to be collapsing. Like the coronavirus stuff, like his real base is old white exurban and suburban folks. And like the handling of this coronavirus is literally killing them. Obviously, like it's much worse in Black communities and in indigenous and on reservations and everywhere where conditions are already worse. Like obviously the pandemic is doing more damage. But nursing homes are also one of those sacrifice zones functionally. The political calculus has really collapsed. And then you have like people are so confused. They have no idea how to handle this moment. And they're just like, they're trying anything they can. And I think for that reason, there's a lot of possibility. And the fascists seem on the back foot. Like their main man, Trump, is losing popularity.
Zoe, I wanted to ask you about, you and William Anderson co-wrote in As Black as Resistance, about this general modus operandi of the state that says it's necessary to maintain order through hyper-surveillance, through mass arrest, through jail time, criminalization of homelessness. And finally, like as Vicky was saying, like there's starting to be like this opening, at least in discussions about this kind of logic and about these structures. What are your thoughts in researching this and now kind of seeing an opening in real time?
First of all, I was not prepared to have to like apply things so quickly. I think one thing that feels a bit perverse is it's like mass death is not something that you ever feel good about being right about, like whether I'm studying genocide, whether I'm studying the violence of the far right, like it's never an I told you so moment. It's more this really frustrated lamentation of people just not listening. Black folks, sex workers, trans folks, all of these different marginalized, disabled folks, people who are chronically ill have for so long been in different ways canaries in the coal mine, and all of the different maltreatments of these communities has kind of foreshadowed this moment of intense crisis, and now we're literally seeing, care providers, physicians, withholding hydroxychloroquine and being like, thank you for your sacrifice, as though people are actually consenting to being like the sacrificial lambs for capitalism. And I think that for me, what was really kind of horrifying to see was there were kind of rumblings of people being upset about the economy not being open, but it really, the opening protests like really escalated when the disaggregated statistics of people who were dying and being hospitalized came out. And once people saw that it was Black folks, it was Indigenous folks, it was Latinx communities that were being devastated, all of a sudden white people became impervious to this virus and started acting as though, capitalism will keep us well. I think that like that has been dystopic. On one hand, it's really exciting to see people recognizing, like, I think that the virus and the pandemic has like really laid bare kind of the necropolitical functioning of the United States. We keep saying like capitalism requires people to die. It requires people to be poor. But the fact that, at one point, what is it, like 32% of like renters couldn't pay rent. We are barreling towards a housing crisis that I don't think anyone can really grasp the magnitude of. We can print money, like we can give people checks. We can postpone rent payments. We can do all kinds of things to ensure that people won't lose their homes, to ensure that people won't lose their access to healthcare because it is tethered to unemployment, and unemployment is skyrocketing. We have people who are standing in queues for unemployment for like upwards of 12 hours a day. There are all of these different ways that in the early days of the pandemic that some proactive measures could have been taken. And it's not to say that there's a silver lining from anything. I'm not one for optimism, but there is something to be said about the fact that people are really looking around for the first time. And there are so many things, so many material things that are impossible to ignore, that are unreformable. Like, what does it mean that landlords are given relief and not their renters who are losing their jobs? What does it mean that millionaires and billionaires are getting these small business protection grants and not people who actually are running these like small businesses or social entrepreneurships or whatever? So what I hope is that I think that there is a habit of like stifling revolutionary energy because no one knows what freedom looks like, right? Like no one knows what revolution looks like. And instead of like leaning into the fact that if we are going to make a change that is transformative, we're going to lose things that are comfortable to us in order to gain a kind of collective safety and security. And it's really difficult for me to see people, talking about abolishing the police or not abolishing and like moving to the left on riots and stuff like that, and like still reading White Fragility or like still reading How to Be an Anti-Racist instead of kind of embracing thoughts and ideas that are about kind of destroying these systems of capital and destroying these capitalist relations and kind of just destroying these ideas of private property. And I get it, like it's really terrifying because private property is like the thing that kind of holds everything together. But either we want people to like be better and be safer and be healthier, or we don't. And I don't like binaries, but we're going to have to kind of go all or nothing on this one.
Yeah. I think one of the things that's been really beautiful about this moment that I think hasn't been talked about a lot is that in the last 7 weeks, we've seen literally every single tactic that has been used in America in a like mass liberatory way has reemerged in the street. Like obviously you had anti-police rioting and looting, but you also had infrastructure shutdowns. You had hacktivism, like people were hacking that. You had indigenous blockades with the shutting down of Trump's event in South Dakota. You had Me Too style callouts, which have been going on for the last 3 weeks, particularly in games and media. And you've had Occupy style encampments with the CHOP and the Chaz and lots of other ones across the country, including some in Philly here, which are led by homeless folks. And I think one thing that you're touching on, Zoe, that things are just going to get really, really brutal with evictions and with the economy. But like, I think we also, for the first time, like you're saying, like people are looking around and seeing it's obvious. And we also like are like the class is in motion and like the Black freedom movement is in motion. And that means we're so much more ready to handle this crisis than we would have been had it come without that. When I was sort of saying this crisis is coming anyway, like it was going to happen, but like we are in this unique position where like, I'm seeing people talk about mass eviction defense, which was like a huge thing that happened in the Great Depression. It was like a really big strategy. In cities, they like completely prevented all evictions. In New York, like 2/3. In Detroit and Chicago, they completely canceled them during the Depression. People would just riot basically against marshals and put people's furniture back in the house. They would call them black bugs, or sometimes they would say call the Reds, because it was black communist organizers in the cities who led most of that. We're at this point again where like the last 10 years of struggle have really consolidated and congealed into this moment when everything's on the line, and it's scary. It's really scary, and it's really intense, and the pandemic continues to be absolute nightmare. But our enemies are very, very weak and disorganized right now in some ways. Obviously, they're also in total control of the state and the capital. Like they're but as far as those conditions go, they're pretty disorganized and pretty confused. And like on the back foot, they're literally like panicking and removing like Columbus statues all over the country because they don't want us to riot and take them down. Like, so there's a lot of opportunity, and there's a lot, but there's also, collapse does not necessarily mean things are going to get better, obviously. So any optimism comes from that feeling that in the last few weeks we've seen a lot of this power congeal. And this level of lull activity that's going on right now for 7 weeks is like nothing else. Like there are maybe 3 other instances of like spontaneous rioting that large in American history: 1877, 1968, and like arguably like some other moments in the labor movement probably, but like, and like throughout the 1960s. But in any case, the fact that happened all across the country, and still 7 weeks in, there are these mass marches happening, is unprecedented. I think it's frankly unprecedented in US history. And the only movement that I think easily blows it out of the water was the general strike of the enslaved and the movement of Marronage that led to Reconstruction. But other than that, like we might be looking at, and I know it feels weird because there isn't this like big organized movement, there isn't like a big party or like anything that we like sort of traditionally associate in the like sort of communist tradition or whatever we associate with real movement. But like there's something real right now happening, and it's wild.
Yeah, and the actions are explicitly anti-police, right? And they began with, as you said, the 3rd Precinct sacking and burning of it, which really just like set the tempo, right? Like it set the pace, it set the discussion. Let's drill down just a little bit on that concept of looting. Like, what is with the red line around looting that doesn't seem to exist around anything else? Like the killing of unarmed blacks in the streets is, so up for debate, like Black Lives Matter,
right.
question mark, right? Yeah. And then it's like AutoZone gets sacked and it's a red line. Like, talk a little bit about that.
It goes back to the very, like the etymology of the word loot, like first emerges, it's taken from a Hindi word meaning plunder, and it's used by English colonial officers to talk about how the way they could gather Indians to repress revolt was by offering them loot. Like from the very beginning, like looting and loot is this idea of a racial relationship to property. And it contains within it the intersection that's very, very hard otherwise to articulate or struggle against between white supremacy and private property, which like was most obviously embodied in slavery and settler colonialism, but which continues directly into the present and remains the backbone of all systems of property, which a lot of people on the left don't really want to admit or talk about, the way in which like property is deeply, deeply racialized, always and always has been. So when you fight the police and you steal property, what you're doing is you're fighting the slave catchers in order to destroy the system by which people can be made into things. So when you like loot a store, you are destroying nature as commodities. Often people will just share. I heard about in the streets of Philly, someone being asked their shoe size outside of a Foot Locker, and then a few moments later getting a handful of sneakers. There's moments like that all over the country, and property relations start to break down. And when property relations start to break down, so too do race relations, because they are ultimately deeply, deeply, if not the same, we do have to understand them as separate, but completely intertwined in a way that they're inseparable while being separate. So looting scares everyone. It's not like a strike, which like just hits at the boss. It's not like and strikes can obviously be anti-racist as well. Like I'm not trying to downplay any other forms of activity that we have available to us, but like looting, especially by a crowd led by Black people in the streets, attacks that entire history of the police, the property, and like whiteness. And that terrifies people, even people who think they're about it, even like especially white people, but like liberals, anyone who thinks they're about liberation, like when they really see what that would look like, it's terrifying to people, and understandably so, because it's the whole world that they live in. briefly being shown to be an absurd lie held by a policeman's baton and a sheet of plate glass.
Yeah, like you wrote in your book that the specter of the slaves freeing themselves is American history's first image of the black looter.
Oh my God, I just want to say that that is one of my favorite lines in the book. It was really interesting to think about not only this kind of very targeted destruction of capital relations, but I was also so interested in the way that there is a pleasure politic to being in the street, to taking things. It's so interesting to think about, you know, what makes this kind of moment different from other moments or flashpoints is the way that it is so enmeshed within the kind of Black freedom struggle. And regardless kind of the sectarian position of the Black group in question, there is always something that is really anarchic about what that struggle is. So yes, the Black Panthers were like avowed Maoists. And also there is something that is really to make a distinction between something being like anarchist TM and being anarchic. There is something that is so powerful and incredible about just, it's obviously horrible to see your needs not being met, but something so empowering about this idea of refusing to wait for your needs to be met and simply doing it yourself, you know? So the Panthers creating these breakfast programs, the Panthers recognizing the disparities of sickle cell in Black communities and like having clinics and having healthcare providers, and not just healthcare providers who would come in and kind of be condescending, but people who were also deeply kind of socialized into this revolutionary idea of care and of service provision. And obviously, I think it's a very bad idea to try and like do a one-to-one replication of anything that has happened in the past, even if it worked well, because material conditions change so quickly in such a short period of time, especially when you're looking at the way that COINTELPRO completely destroyed the Black movement from like the 50s to the 80s. But it's been so heartening to see like the free produce refrigerators that have been like popping up in major cities around the country. It's been amazing to see medics, especially like Black people being medics, because often when I've gone to actions, it's usually been some like punky white person as a medic. But it's just been so incredible to see the kind of fullest articulation of what the Black struggle looks like in, you know, on the streets, you know, doing reproductive labor. It's great. I love it. It's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, like chasing cops out of precincts. Like, Vicky, I don't know, in your book, I went through it. Like, is there a parallel to that in American history of cops like literally running out the back door while people chase them as they burn their precinct? Like, it's a remarkable moment.
I genuinely believe, and I actually wrote a piece about that in the weeks following. I genuinely believe it's unprecedented. Someone pointed out that like in the 80s, Hasidic Jews rioted and like drove police out of a precinct in New York at one point, some racist treatment, but that wasn't part of a sustained, you know, anti-police movement. It was cool. Like it was a moment of rebellion, but no, we're recording this on Bastille Day. I think that's what we saw. It broke literally a century of propaganda, media propaganda about the invulnerability of the police. One of the things that happened in the wake of the 60s movement, like, you know, the Panthers, you know, said off the pigs, like they were very explicitly anti-cop. The degree to which the media has spent every waking moment glorifying police, like frankly, since then, is disgusting. And it took a bunch of Black teens with some fire, you know, shutting down a precinct. Like after 3 days of rioting, it was incredible. But like suddenly all that stuff shattered. It was so weak ultimately. Like people's experience of the police is so, even a lot of folks who benefit from white supremacy, benefit from the way capitalism is organized, but tend to be poor working class, I think mostly, not rich people actually we're talking about here, like could see through it suddenly. They're not a timeless force. They're not all powerful. They don't have control of the situation. And that was just visibly, materially clear to everyone in the street. That made abolition seem possible.
I mean, I think the important part of any social contract is like, I don't know. I think it's so silly to like take the founders at their word, but I think the idea of consenting to governance is so important.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, we don't have a very good social construction of consent, but the most important thing about consent is that it can be revoked. And, you know, it says in the Constitution or whatever document that if they do not feel that the values of this new republic are being upheld, then we are entitled to and are obligated to destroy it. And that is the only thing of the founding fathers that I hold to be of any value. The fact that I am given a mandate as a person who is being governed, that when I do not feel that the governance is just, that I can withdraw my consent to being governed. And I think that that's what we're seeing with the police. Like, people are refusing to recognize and to legitimize the authority of the police. And I'm not going to be like, this is what real patriotism is, because I think that patriotism is like a silly concept. But I think that that's a really exciting kind of power that people are stepping into collectively.
Right. And with tangible results already, just in the weeks since, George Floyd was murdered, we've seen all sorts of major school districts cancel their contracts with school police systems. We couldn't imagine 2 months ago that abolition of the police and the carceral state would actually be kind of like a mainstream discussion. There are these discussions happening between abolition versus defunding. How do we parse that out? How do we take a hold of this moment and really push for abolition?
I have the sort of polemic that I think we should be advancing, which is that abolition of the police does not mean the end of the police departments in particular. It also means the end of prisons. And if we are ending the police, then there is no possibility of property anymore, which means the end of property. And if we're going to talk about that, we're talking about the end of whiteness, because whiteness is ultimately the property from which all other forms of property ownership devolve. So when we say abolish the police, people say, no, defund. It's no, defunding the police isn't enough, because I want the prisons gone, I want the psychiatric wards gone, and I want fucking whiteness over. And that's what I mean by abolition. When I say abolish the police, I mean abolish all of it. I mean a total transformation of our social relations. Policing is mostly a structure of consent that we accept. It mostly works by us managing ourselves and behaving legally, because we're afraid. I mean, mostly because we're afraid, we're oppressed, but also it's how we control our own relations too. And it's how we deal with each other all the time in policing style ways. And abolition means getting it out of ourselves, out of our communities, and out of the social in general. And that means much, much more than the boys in blue. If they were to all go away tomorrow, but the same amount of money was to go to mental health care professionals and also a team, and but the military's still there, and the prisons are still there, nothing, we haven't won. That's not abolition, right? That's just that's a step, because defund is one step towards abolish.
The most kind of evident prison, other than jails and police things, is the hospital. And I think it's been really horrible to see the kind of carceral logics of disposability and expendability playing out when we're looking at people struggling to access healthcare. The mayor of LA, in response to protests or whatever, shutting down a number of testing sites around the city or something like that, literally weaponizing access to care. And also, I think maybe, to take it a step further, it's yes, thinking about these material institutions, and it's also thinking about social institutions. It's thinking about the relationship between the maintenance of gender and the carceral structure, looking at trans folks being policed and being arrested and being sent to whichever binary sex holding facilities match their genitals. And if that doesn't work out, it's seeing people being sent to administrative segregation. And we see Layleen Polanco dying when she didn't have to. No one should be in ADSEG, first of all. But also, we see that prisons are a really cruel site of deprivation of health resources. I just saw some incarcerated folks holding signs up to tiny windows that were being sealed by the correction officers. And one of them said that cis women in there were not being given pads and were bleeding on themselves. And that denial of very basic menstrual care as a thing that is deeply shameful and dehumanizing and just cruel for the sake of cruelty. It's thinking about, I hate hospitals, and studying the sociology of medicine. When we're thinking about the kind of evolution of kind of medical discourses, there are three things you can think about. You think about like bedside medicine when, people had doctors coming to their homes. You have clinical medicine where we're really starting to see like the birth of the clinic and everything that Foucault is writing about. And the kind of era or the paradigm that we're in now is called surveillance medicine. It's no longer simply about a state of health and unhealth as the role you play as a sick person. We are now all on a spectrum of unhealth. And now keeping ourselves well becomes about our commitments to citizenship. It becomes about the policing of ourselves and other people. And I think that this is playing out really interestingly. For example, when we're talking about masks, it's really seductive to like laugh at folks who are like conservatives who are going to parties and are like, ha ha ha, this is dumb and dying. And at the same time, it is cruel and it is carceral to kind of think about this individualization of responsibility and of guilt when, yes, of course, we need to wear masks and we need to wash our hands and we need to take all of these precautions. And also the government needs to be paying us to stay home, and the government needs to not be opening schools, and the government needs to be making sure that everyone has a home and will continue to have a home and shouldn't be paying rent. And the government should be doing all of these things. But instead, the kind of onus and the responsibility is on us, and especially on people who are even more deprived of resources and even less able to keep themselves safe because of the traffic that they experience and like people passing by and the work that they have to do. That to me also is a prison. And so abolition, everything that Vicky said about defunding being, it's important to reduce the scope of activity of the police. And also it makes no sense to defund or whatever the police and uphold like West Point's anti-racist commitments as though they're not literally being trained to like go murder people in Afghanistan and Iraq and wherever else. We have to think about the police and also militarization and militarism and also land theft and dispossession and also the medical system and also gender and also the nuclear family and all of these things. And it is overwhelming, yes. And also I think there's something that's really exciting because I have been forced to kind of rethink my personal relations with my family, my relationship to work as I've been really struggling to get anything done. And instead of being like, well, yes, like this is a moment of kind of cataclysmic upheaval. Of course you can't work. Instead of leaning into that, I'm just like, okay, how do I just sleep less and just double time this? So, it's getting rid of the cops in the world and the kind of cop and boss and overseer and whatever in your own head.
All of these techniques of efficiency are based in warehousing people together. Schools warehouse people to be educated together. Hospitals warehouse people who are sick to be treated together, right? Prisons warehouse people who are bad to be punished together. And like all of these modes of like warehousing and controlling and dominating, which as Christina Sharp, as her argument points out, like when things get more intense, that warehousing gets more direct, right? Like you see people getting stuck in prison buses for hours, like that, like the analogy gets clearer and clearer as like the state starts to break down, like to the slave ship itself as a logistic site of like organization. Hospitals are putting everyone sick in the same place is a really bad way to take care of people, especially when we know that somatic response is so important and that like people feeling safe and well is so important to healing. And we don't understand that stuff, but it's really efficient for capital. It's really efficient to get all the sick and disabled people in one place and like not have to think about them anywhere else. People only learning in specialized units, in specialized places is really, really inefficient for a world of learning and flourishing, but it's really, really good to like separate out children, to separate out workers, like, right? All of these, and obviously the factory being the big one I haven't named about warehousing people, which is obviously like the plantation, of course. What I think is both hard and important to understand is that all of those systems are held together by the threat of ultimately of like police violence. If you can't get evicted from your house, and if you don't have to pay rent, like, why are you going to go to work? But like the police is the agent, like the eviction court and the lawsuit and the security guard at the food store. These are the agents that make it impossible for you to follow that rationale. Like, I have a roof, I'm fine, I don't need to work. I hate this job, like I don't want to go. All of those logics are enforced by the police and policing as a broader, not just as the individuals in that particular instinct of like boss, landlord, police, but like also just in the broader society. So abolition like means the end of those relations as well, ultimately. It means the end of landlords. Landlords can't exist without eviction courts. I think that's why liberals have hopped on defund so hard, because abolition, even when you sort of quibble about what abolition means, ultimately people start drawing that logical line. Oh, there's no police? Like, I'm not going to go to work then because I'm not going to get evicted out of my house. Oh, there's no police? Like, what's going to keep people in those prisons? Like that. So there is a sort of abolition that is meaningless, which is like just like return to the Klan and like white terrorists or whatever, right? And like the feds. Like there could be some horrible, like really, really awful capitalist innovation that if we don't win in this moment will come to pass. If we don't win in this moment, that will come to pass in some way or another. The police as they exist now are clearly insupportable socially. So like something is going to change. And if we don't win, it'll change for the worse. But also, abolition as a demand is very powerful because if you start to think about it, you start to draw all those lines.
I think what you're talking about with work makes me think a lot about, I was tweeting about this the other day, and this is going to sound really silly given that all I do kind of all day, every day is like read about genocide. But one of the scariest concepts whenever I encounter it, and that like really makes me nervous when I see it, is the word work shy. Because it's, the first time I encountered it, it was in the context of the Nazi Holocaust, and it was the ways that they were talking about the Roma and the Sinti being asocial and work shy and all of that. And also, it makes me think a lot about the kind of logic of slave masters, where they said that because enslaved Black people had like weaker lungs, the labor would revitalize the blood. And the forced labor is what would enable them to survive or to live. And when I encountered it the most recently, a couple of days ago, I was reading about the Herero and Nama genocide. And this was the justification that the colonial governor used for concentration camps, and specifically for the forced labor within concentration camps, because he said that it would alleviate the Herero of their work shyness, because all of the cattle had died of like this outbreak of rinderpest. And he's like, they're just going to wander around because all their cattle is dead and there's nothing for them to do. There's something that is so deeply scary and fascistic about someone's kind of value being entirely defined by their work, to this idea that work is a prerequisite for health in some way. And then 3, it is this relation of labor that Vicky was saying kind of tethers a person to citizenship within a nation state, but also locating them as a kind of capitalist subject. It is this like profound alienation that is inherent to this. I mean, I hate wage slavery because like slavery actually existed
Right.
and exists, but it is this tethering to this kind of unending, at least until retirement when you're 80, this unending workday that kind of goes on forever, and you are productive and you are a good citizen when you are working.
Mm-hmm.
And you are work shy. Actually, The Economist just used the word work shy in talking about coronavirus in the Black community, talking about how the virus affects both the industrious and work shy alike.
Oh my God.
So I think, yeah, this idea of labor is really valuable and really central, because it's like, if everyone was employed, would we be here? Would we be going on however many weeks of like protracted being out on the streets? I don't know. Maybe not.
One of the main arguments for the introduction of the indentured servant trade in the U.S. colonies was the unsuitability of indigenous people for servanthood. They were unsuitable. They were not motivated. Of course, like they were unsuitable because they were being subjected to genocide, right? Like the unsuitability like becomes post facto justification like for what's already going on. Also, and not to be like this girl on the internet, but like the fact that is it Treblinka, the Arbeit macht frei, right? Work
Right.
makes you free.
Yeah, I
think people tend to talk about that as being kind of ironic. I think they're wrong. It's not ironic at all. They just don't understand who the subject is. So in a genocidal system, the work of the oppressed makes the real subjects free. So Jews and Roma and communists and queers working themselves to death for the Reich makes Nazis free. That relation between work and freedom is literal. It is not like
It's not a metaphor.
It's not a metaphor. Exactly. Yeah. Like that phrase about work. Work is about dividing the subject. So like who is a subject of society, who gets its benefits and who doesn't. And the police are there to enforce and make sure that you don't fucking get uppity and like think you're a subject when you're not, among many, many other things, obviously.
Absolutely. I mean, this is the basis of my whole dissertation, that genocide is not simply exterminatory. It is a productive process. The Nazis were not simply intending on killing everyone. This former German state would arise like this Aryan nation after all of these unproductive beings had been annihilated.
Your co-author, Zoe William C. Anderson, wrote in Roar magazine, quote, "We're always fighting against the odds because there is no respite in a perpetually abusive state. It can only function through this abuse, so we can only prevail through organizing grounded in radical love and solidarity." How can Black revolutionary moments and Black anarchism in particular respond to this moment?
Part of the reason that I was so inspired to, kind of first write our Roar piece and then this book with William was because we were so interested in thinking about how Black people have always sought to undermine the state in a way, to think about sociality as not revolving around the citizen subject, as is kind of the preoccupation of like white Western political thought. The kind of intention or the primary objective, the main issue, at hand was figuring out any way that they could survive by any means necessary. And it looked like so many things. It was so incredibly dynamic. There were maroon societies. There was community building in like urban settings. There's always been this attempt to evade surveillance and to evade monitoring. And obviously, yes, there have always been people who are making appeals to rights and to eligibility as human within the system, which obviously makes sense, right? When you were literally enslaved and literally chattelized. But even in those appeals, and even as those appeals are ongoing, there are always these kind of complementary communal structures and what we would formalize and formally describe as mutual aid of like watching families and children and providing food and cooking for one another. I mean, Moynihan and others were like lamenting the destruction of the nuclear family in the Black community. And there are so many reasons that the Black family has been destroyed. It's not because of Black deviance, but also there is so much like dynamism in what a family structure can be. It is not singularly defined by a mother, a father, and a child. It is about extended family. It is about chosen family. It is about all of these different ways of making and affirming kin that exist like kind of far outside of what capitalism reinscribes as being good and normal and necessary. And that to me, this kind of organic way of relating and taking care of one another is to me the most important part of Black anarchism, the Black radical tradition, Black life, whatever you want to call it. Obviously, yes, people are reading and theorizing, like that's not to pretend that that's not happening. And also it seems like the priority is praxis. The priority is kind of figuring out how to do the thing, having an idea of what the thing entails and kind of continually changing the way that the thing is expressed depending on how well that works. And that kind of like living politic is really exciting. When people are having these debates online about whether they need to like read Marx or like reading is bad or whatever, I always like to remind people that, my uncle was a guerrilla and, he tells me about obviously training and then there's political education in the bush, like people reading and talking about theory and thinking about what it means on the other side of fighting your colonizer and what the state looks like. Obviously, we're not going to romanticize it because it is rife with all kinds of like gender nonsense. And we've seen how some of the people who were part of the struggle have materialized some of their ideas. But there's something that's so powerful to me about people with varying levels of education, like formerly uneducated peasants in the middle of the bush, like thinking about what it means to be free, fighting this war and like taking care of one another. Like in Rhodesia, it was really important that the internment structure, it was obviously to like kind of deterritorialize as in other places, but it was primarily to prevent people from resourcing the guerrillas. to prevent people from the expansion of solidarity outside of those who are doing kind of respectable protests and those who are taking on the state directly. And I think, the way the state is coming after Antifa with literally the joint terror task forces and continually talking about this new boogeyman. It was communist, now it's Antifa. I think it speaks to, the state recognizes that it represents a threat. And I think that that's important. I think it's bad that people are going to get caught up in all of these criminal, different ways and new ways it's going to invent to criminalize people the longer this goes on, especially with housing stuff, especially if it starts to get messy and people's kids start getting involved. And, but I think that when the state is talking about you, you're probably doing something right, and you should keep doing it probably, but smart.
Zoe and Vicky, thank you so much for being with us on The Brief.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much for having us. It's my pleasure.
That was a lot of fun. There's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah, as you said, this is just one of many discussions that we're going to be having on The Brief about the carceral state and abolition and people's revolution.
Yeah, so let's track a little bit the trajectory of modern militarized policing, because the New York Times pointed out these are the largest demos in U.S. history. The last major insurrection in the United States in the 1960s is what really led to this militarization of police with the founding of the SWAT teams after the Watts riots. Right. Which were originally named Special Weapons Attack Team, and they decided to change that terminology to Special Weapons and Tactics. But essentially, they're an assault force, right? They took the colonial logic, the imperial logic of policing, offensive policing, and extended it to the drug war. So between the 1970s, after the insurrection, the way the state attacked it was with a massive increase in policing, a massive increase in prisons. Prison population went from 200,000 in the 1970s to over 1 million by the early 1990s. And 43% increase in human cages built between 1990 and 2015. Every 10 days for 25 years, there was a new prison launched in the United States, leaving us with the situation where we have now in the United States 5% of the population, 25% of the prisoners. 1/3 of blacks born today will be in jail at some time in their life. And we wanted to look a little bit, just dig in a bit to what they were talking about the history of abolition. The previous term for abolition, its original connotation was related to slavery, of course, but it has evolved through the years, just as slavery did. In 1888, Frederick Douglass said that emancipation and Reconstruction was a stupendous fraud, and abolition is an ongoing struggle rooted in slavery. And slavery didn't end in that sense. It evolved, right? It evolved from plantations to prison camps. And it was an enforcing of a white hierarchy through lynchings and violence as soon as the slaves freed themselves and were freed. The lynchings in America and quasi-state violence that took place to limit and enforce that racial hierarchy. And so that's the key to understanding the history and the legacy of these institutions. At what point did the mandate of policing change from that original message? There wasn't one point in their history where the RCMP or the NYPD said, oh no, actually, we're now a completely different force than we were built and constructed in the first place to be. There's no point of departure from the slave catchers or genocidaires of the police forces for the indigenous population at first, and then the slave population after that.
And so when people talk about reforming the police or, defunding some of the police, it doesn't cut to the root of the problem at all, which is white supremacy, which is settler colonialism, which is violence against Indigenous and Black people, these ideals that this country was founded on. So when Vicky and Zoe were talking about the morphing of enslavement of people in bondage on plantations to then warehousing of people and a captive labor force in prisons, and kind of even a more macro view of what it means to warehouse people in prison hospitals and to warehouse people in sweatshops and to warehouse people in school systems that are heavily policed and provide, a pipeline to juvenile and then adult prisons. It's all under the same rubric. And so when we talk about abolition, we talk not just about abolishing the police, which has to happen, but abolishing the entire center of whiteness and white supremacy in this country, and really reimagining a society in which people are not caged or warehoused or enslaved under capitalism, under racial supremacy. And this moment, how it's really highlighting the need for taking abolition to be that macro view through that lens.
That's the pitfall of defunding, right? If we get caught up in the pitfall of defunding, you can have something like 10% of the resources of the police department transferred. But if you keep your focus on abolition, there's no way to do that without a radical assessment, an anti-capitalist assessment, an anti-imperialist assessment, of course, because you can't want to abolish the police on the streets of New York or Atlanta, but have them patrolling the streets of Fallujah or Kandahar, as the case may be.
Exactly. So it also dovetails with internationalizing the struggle against the carceral state, the struggle against imperialism, the struggle against militarism and domination. So obviously this is a conversation that we're going to keep going as conditions change on the ground. Hopefully we'll be closer to to that new society that we all envision. This is quite a moment.
Yeah, because abolition of the police necessarily becomes the seed of the revolution in this case. So we will stay in the streets.
Yes, or on the microphones, or both.
So just a little housekeeping here at the end. Nora, we're going to take a little break for August and come back in September with season 2 of The Brief.
And we'll have more of the radical analysis of world events that you've come to expect from us here at The Brief, including topics such as pirates and prison breaks and even a book corner. So be sure to subscribe at Patreon, patreon.com/thebrief.
Subscribe at Patreon, friends.
Do it.
The Brief is produced by
Pierre Loiselle in Quebec,
Nora Barrows-Friedman in California,
and I'm John Elmer in Toronto. Our music is by Greg Wilson, art by Tyson Kingsbury, and I want to say a special thanks to Shane Karitko for his help this season. Follow us on Twitter at The Brief Pod.
Subscribe everywhere and like us, share us, all that stuff, but also tell your friends about The Brief, but preferably with a mask on. Please wear your masks. See you in September.
Stay safe, guys.
Bye. Stay safe.